So as many of you all know, Haley and I recently got an Airbnb property in Grand Lake, Colorado, which is quite the place. It's surrounded by Colorado's largest natural lake, not to be confused with all these unnatural lakes we've got going on in Colorado, Granby, all these reservoirs. But Grand Lake's real. It's a real lake. Hashtag real lake, the deepest one in Colorado. And it's a really interesting community around there with some interesting history. So we're going to go through how Grand Lake was formed, the history of Grand Lake, which is filled with a lot of blood and tribulation, just like any good old Western story should be. And then we're going to move into Grand Lake today, some of the local businesses that are there, as well as some of the things to do in Grand Lake. And if you're thinking about purchasing in Grand Lake, we're going to go through the real estate there, prices there, some of the regulations there around short-term rentals that we didn't really know at the beginning. So let's go on a journey to Grand Lake, Colorado. Oh, we're going to talk about the forming of Grand Lake, which is the deepest and the biggest lake in the state of Colorado, actually. The waters are so cold, you can see in some of these videos here, during the winter it's completely frozen over. People are playing hockey. You can actually snowmobile directly on the lake. So I want to go back in history, millions of years back in history, because Grand Lake looked a lot different then than it does now. As you drive into Grand Lake, you're going to go through a town called Granby on the US 40. You get off on 34, which is actually an entrance into Rocky Mountain National Park, which is how Grand Lake became something on the map, you know. But before that, Grand Lake meant something to the natives that were in that area. Grand Lake was formed, I think, like between 30,000 and 10,000 BC by glaciation. It actually is the beginning of and kind of intersects the headwaters of the Colorado River, which is one of the longest rivers in the world. So that all comes from Grand Lake. And because of that, it's really not surprising that Native Americans found it as something spiritual. Actually, it's a little bit eerie what they thought about Grand Lake, because that water is so dang cold. So the Utes, which were Colorado's longest Native American tribe, they've been here the longest. The Cheyenne, the Arapaho, they invaded later, called this lake Spirit Lake because they thought that the dead spirits of their tribe inhabited this lake, which is what kept it so dang cold.
When was Grand Lake discovered?
When was Grand Lake discovered? Well, it's at time immemorial, so as long as the Utes have been here, since it was at the center of Ute tradition. They would also be there during the summer, since Grand Lake is a cooler place to be during the summer, to avoid the hot Colorado days. So, I mean, it's been there and it's been inhabited for a really long time. But when, I think it was the Cheyenne came and attacked from Wyoming up in the north, they were given horses by white people and they were able to now come and attack. They came in and they actually swooped over the mountains where the Utes were staying in Grand Lake and descended on the Ute Indians, and it was a pretty big massacre. So the Utes to this day considered Grand Lake as a cursed place.
Now we explore Grand Lake's history through Western expansion and some of its bloodiest murders on July 4th and the Hermit of Grand Lake.
The town of Grand Lake was laid out in 1879, 4 years before the shootings, by a group of men led by William Redmond. There's some great journals from all these Grand Lake OGs on the Grand Lake Area Historical Society's website, for those of you that want to dig even deeper. So 1879, it really kind of gets laid out by this guy coming in, grabbing a bunch of land. And this guy was described by historians of the time as a rough and ready character, quick to shoot. So quick from the hip there. He had an able lieutenant and his brother, and his name was apparently Bass Redmond. So you had the Redmond brothers, yeah, William and Bass. And a lot of these folks that were early Colorado folks that came in were a part of the Civil War, and then there were surveys done of the area. A lot of these OGs came in, so they were pretty used to, in other words, pretty used to violence, which also was, the thing that made colonizing possible, because you had these brutal people coming in and taking over land that was claimed by the Native Americans and taking it generally in pretty brutal means, right? So the problem is these brutal men not only disagreed with Native Americans, but oftentimes disagreed with themselves. So now we got the Redmonds that have established the area, and then the area starts to grow, and ambitions start around Grand Lake. You remember earlier we had talked about kind of being a summertime place.
I see what's it. So John G. Mills, that reckless man, was an ally to the Redmonds, who lived in Teller, which is another town, that mining town that sympathized with Hot Sulphur Springs. So meanwhile, the rest of Teller was supporting the Hot Sulphur Springs faction. But Mills, through his fortune, in with the Grand Lake crowd. So at that time, Charles W. Royer of Hot Sulphur was another leader in the Redmond Mills crew and was elected sheriff of Grand County in 1881. And then he appointed Bill Redmond as his deputy of Grand Lake. Opposing this Grand Lake faction was another crowd equally desperate. The leader was E.P. Weber, manager of the Wolverine Mine near Rabbit Ears. Wow, that's Barney Day, famous Indian fighter and frontier marksman, was another leader in the Hot Sulphur faction. So they've got a pretty reckless side building up there as well. Royer is elected sheriff. That's the Grand Lake. So now they've taken over the legal part of the county. You know what I'm saying? And there was another campaign in 1882 where it got deeper. Henry R. Walcott was nominated for governor under the sponsorship of Senator Nathaniel P. Hill and was opposed by Jerome B. Chaffee. I don't know what any of it. Oh, here we go. A rum convention was held by 7 delegates in the new county seat of Grand Lake, and Weber and Dean were sent as delegates to the Republican convention as anti-Walcott men. Weber made a speech attacking Mills, who was one of the on the Redmond Grand Lake side, calling him a murderer and a fugitive from justice, which is true. At the beginning of 1883, Mills was chairman of the county commissioners. They just got these criminals running Grand County. I love it. And Barney Day was a member. Wilson Waldron and H.B. Rogerson made up the rest of the board. Rogerson found the feud becoming too bitter for him, and then he resigned. That guy was smart. He's like, I'm going to get out of here before this stuff ends in blood, which is a common way to settle things back then. And Weber was named in his place. This set the stage for the happenings of July 4th. A report was circulated that Weber and Day were planning a meeting of the county commissioners to oust the county clerk and treasurer without notifying Chairman Mills. So now, basically the Hot Sulphur side is planning a coup d'etat of Grand Lake. So they're going to get these people out of there. A quarrel arose then between Weber and Lew W. Pollard, the county clerk, as to the legality of the meeting, and he refused to produce the records. So that guy clearly took the Grand Lake side. It's like, dude, this is a coup. This is not legal. It's not January 6th. I'm sorry, let's not go there. A date for the special meeting was set, and Monday, July 2nd, the commissioners met. Okay, so now we're on July 2nd. The board considered matters all day, and at dusk an order was handed to Sheriff Royer, who was with the Mills faction, to appear before the board and show why his bond should not be declared insufficient and himself removed from office. So they're like, resign peacefully or else, right? This was the first intimidation, I guess is what they're not. This was the first intimidation of the plans of the Weber Day faction, but public opinion was aroused to a higher pitch when it was found similar action was planned against the county clerk, county treasurer, and county judge. So it wasn't enough for them to kick one person out illegally. They're like, let's move on 3 more. In those days, the Fairview House, owned by Mrs. M.J. Young, was the leading hotel. Here, Weber, Day, Dean, and many Teller people were staying. So the town moved over and occupied their hotels. At about 9 o'clock, this is happened on July 4th, folks. About 9 o'clock, July 4th, a full sight of 12 to 15 shots was heard, but hotel guests believed it was only more holiday fireworks. How convenient. I think July 4th is one of the most dangerous nights that there is anyways, right? Because of that reason. No different back then. So they're shooting people in the middle of all the fireworks, and suddenly a man rushed up the road from the town and said, Weber has been shot. So Weber's the first one to go down. Guests rushed down the road, among them Deputy Sheriff Max James of Teller. We got the deputy from Teller coming on down. About 200 yards away, Weber was found shot through his right lung. Not far off, Dean was found shot through the bridge of his nose and the hip. His head was badly cut by blows. At the corner of the hotel's old ice house nearby, with his head in the lake, Barney Day was found shot through the heart. Hey. In the middle of the road, close by, a 4th body afterward recognized as John G. Mills. We got some bodies on both sides here. Over his head was a flour sack with holes cut for the eyes and mouth. A bullet had been fired into his head at such close range, the cloth mask was burned. A trail of blood led from the scene to the outlet of the lake 300 yards away, and then was lost. And following the trail, Deputy James found a second mask similar to the one of Mills. The bodies of the dead men were taken to the Grand Lake and the wounded to the Fairview House. Weber died at midnight and Dean died July 17th. He made it a little bit. That's pretty crazy.
That's where it got interesting.
That's where it got interesting right there. That was like a real Quentin Tarantino scene. It was just all built up.
Yeah, I almost would have liked to have heard that backwards.
Yeah.
I wish I would have heard that first and then got all the details and maybe changed.
Perfect. Well, that's how we can edit it. All the circumstances indicated 6 to 9 men were in the attacking party, although only 3 took part in the actual shooting. So Weber, it was believed, was shot first from the ambush. And then Day and Dean, which were his friends, were shot after that. They were then attacked and the fight became general. Dean was shot in this melee, as was Mills, and Day ran from the scene. As he neared...
I'm surprised they didn't make a movie about this.
Yeah, this is a cool one, right? As he neared the ice house, he saw Sheriff Royer approaching. Feeling relieved at seeing an officer of the law, he ran toward him. Royer, it was charged, pulled his gun and shot Day through the chest. And then Day died immediately. But apparently he had a conscience about this. It didn't stop there. Royer is alleged to have made a confession to Ad Kinney, a liveryman in Georgetown. Georgetown's right on the other side of the mountain there. He made it quite a ways, so he was, he had to be booking it out of there after this was all said and done to get all the way to Georgetown. So in the following August, Royer killed himself in the inn's house in Georgetown and saw Kinney just before. He said this. He said, "This thing is quote-unquote getting on my nerves," Royer said. "They're shadowing me all the time. I never saw a town so full of detectives." So in other words, he's getting followed by these people from Grand Lake. He said, "Everywhere I go, I am watched. And there's Barney Day, too. He's looking at me all the time." He's dead, by the way. "He haunts my thoughts. I see him there right before me, smiling at me like a friend." Direct quote.
So he was dead when he was...
He was dead when he's saying this. So he's seeing Barney Day, the dead spirit is haunting him.
So
Either,
he killed himself in Georgetown?
So he killed himself in Georgetown because he was getting followed by all these people from Grand Lake. And his mind was haunted. Perhaps he was really haunted even by Barney Day.
I feel like you could easily make a movie about that. Just call it Grand Lake.
I know, this is a great movie. This is a great one. And this is all good shit.
This wounded man who left the trail of blood to the outlet of the lake was believed to have been Bill Redman. So Redman was shot here too. It was found Redman fled to the mountains. So Redman's getting out of town too, because they're coming after these guys, and hid in a mountain cabin about 4 miles northwest of Grand Lake. His wounds were dressed by doctors brought by friends over there. Then he's going to flee even further. When he was able to travel, he was taken by his brother, good old Bass again, through Middle and Egeria parks to a hiding place at the northern foot of the Flat Top Mountains. He remained there some time, and then he fled to Utah. It's around like Grand Lake area, and then to Utah. The body of a man was found there, a suicide or murdered. To his saddle was pinned the name William Redman. Investigation revealed this was not Redman. And it was found later Redman had fled to Arizona, and later it was said to South America. So he staged himself dying, then went out of the country. Alonzo Coffin was tried at Golden in connection with the murders, but was acquitted. Others also were tried, but no convictions ever were obtained on this one. The county seat, however, was moved back to Hot Sulphur Springs in 1888, and that smoothed out most of the bitterness of the county's politics. So all these Grand Lake guys that got ambitious and moved the county seat very fast found out that Hot Sulphur Springs was not messing around. So after some of them died and some of them left, moved on back to Hot Sulphur Springs.
So, we're talking about the Grand Lake Hermit murder?
We're talking about the Grand Lake, the Hermit of Grand Lake. So if we thought that other murder was interesting, this one I think is equally interesting. I think it's of note that a lot of Grand Lake's economy comes through summer tourism. So throughout time, we're going to see different entrepreneurs take advantage of the tourism that comes to Grand Lake. And this guy was kind of at the beginning of it, the Hermit of Grand Lake. So we got to go back quite a ways in Grand Lake's history to when Frederick Saylock, which is his name, came on over to Grand Lake, and he started gobbling up land. And he was one of the primary landowners around Grand Lake. He's one of your OG townies there, so to speak. And Grand Lake's got a lot of locals. They'll talk to you about Grand Lake history. They'll talk to you about how their family came to Grand Lake. It's not much different, it feels like, than it was back then. And he was the original townie, so to speak, because he had a lot of this land, hundreds of acres in the area. And with land, especially in the Western days, came land disputes. So there's a couple people that way back had a land dispute over a fence line, Ray Noakes and Arthur Osborne. So fast forward, Saylock's old now. He's in his cabin. Saylock was known to come into town and help townies out. He was very generous with his money. He gave away his money freely to people. He gave away money to people that needed money. So he was kind of like the grandfather of the town, so to speak. So most people really liked this guy. But he wouldn't come into town so often. He was called the Hermit of Grand Lake for a reason. And that's because most of the time, Frederick was just on over there at his cabin. He'd come into town once or twice a week. And the locals really liked him coming into town. Of course, he had friends in town that he would talk with. And when he did not come into town after a week, they wondered, where was he? So the other interesting thing about Saylock is he owned land, he was rich, he didn't trust banks. So a lot of people think that he had about $500,000 buried on his property really close to his house somewhere. So that $500,000 at that time was a lot of money. You know, that's a lot of money. So this guy's got it there. He's got these two people that don't like him very much. So they just discover he's not really in town. Where the heck is this guy? So they go out and they found his house. They didn't find him, but they found that the house was ransacked, the floorboards were torn up, and he was nowhere. so that an investigation by the local sheriff was unable to identify any leads. The intrigue surrounding the hermit and his wealth made the crime mystery a national story. So in those times, they had newspapers that had these true crime stories. They were the Netflix series of the day. And an article in True Detectives Mysteries magazine described the crime in the June 1930 issue. This article had the title Echo Mountain's Hanging Spectre and was written by A.G. Gertz of the Denver Post, and that's out there. You can actually read this. So Salok's sister was in California at this time and heard, so they just kind of assumed he was dead. And it was winter in Grand Lake, and if you've been to Grand Lake in the winter, you know it's not so easy to go around unless you got a snowmobile, because there's a lot of snow on the ground. So mounting like a search for Salok wasn't so possible. But the town members were fired up, and I don't know if it's because they loved the guy or they thought the guy had $500,000 by his house, and they were determined as soon as that snow melted, they were going to go out and look for this guy. Grand Lake held true to their word. We find that Grand Lake runs a little slower in the winter. It's hard to get some maintenance people to our Airbnb sometimes. I imagine it was pretty similar then. Grand Lake's running slow in the winter, but then really upticks in the spring. People wake up from their hibernation and they're like, let's get this money. I mean, the guys that killed Salok. So now they go on out and they send the hounds out. The hounds find that he is hanging in the woods by the neck. And apparently, I was reading the account of his death, and his noose was tied improperly, so when they hung him, his neck didn't break, he suffocated to death, and his feet were almost touching the ground. So not a really pleasant way, quite gruesome way to go for old Freddy boy over here. There still wasn't any leads, but apparently these two guys that we had talked about were found on August 17th.
Why did he get hung?
They hung him to kill him because they were looking for his gold, or his $500,000 on the property. And there was also that fencing dispute.
Oh, they killed him.
Why? Yeah, well, they weren't the smartest guys, especially once you hear how they got caught. So, when they were over there, they told everyone that they only found $75 and some old coins, and which is how they got caught, because they were in town trying to buy some normal stuff. These were like collector's coins, so it's like going to a 7-Eleven and trying to pay for a Gatorade with a 9/11 memorabilia coin from Fox News. It's not going to happen. But they go into town and they start to barter with some people. They got these old coins to try to buy some stuff in Grand Lake. And the townies that liked Salok were like, oh, that's a little bit suspicious. So these guys were eventually arrested for the murders. They only found the $75 and then some of those old coins that they had tried that were from Salok's property. It was the coins, like I said, that got him caught. So rumors of the hidden cash persisted, and in March of 1927, convinced there must be more valuables or cash stashed somewhere on the property, the townspeople planned a search of this property as soon as the snow cleared. I looked it up, and it was pretty interesting because the sister came from California, the town people came, they all looked for this $500,000. No one ever found it. So maybe even to this day, there's $500,000 buried, or maybe Ray Noakes and Arthur Osborne got it to their family in Missouri, where their family was located. I kind of looked into it myself. That family doesn't seem to have gotten rich by any means, so that one would be a little bit surprising to me. So for all ye treasure hunters out there in Colorado, there's $500,000 somewhere in Colorado. Okay, we're back in, right? So where were we at? Where were we at in history? We were talking the late. That was 26 when that murder happened. But rewind. We're gonna go to 1920 right now.
So that whole murder was over.
You gonna ask questions about that murder when we're talking about fucking Fall River Road, Rick?
Yeah, we got that.
You kidding me, dude? We already moved on from the murders. No, I'm just kidding. Go ahead. I just wanted to get some of that commentary in there. I thought that would make it more natural.
So, I mean, the reason that they killed the guy was because they were trying to steal his shit, pretty much.
Well, they felt that, you know, he was kind of greedy with that land dispute, and moving their fence. And then years and years later, I guess they were still grudgy about it, and they're like, yeah, let's murder him and take his money.
I wonder what that money would be equivalent to today.
Just look it up, 500,000 in 1926. What would that be worth today?
500,000 back in 1926 would have been $8,290,418.99.
It's around 8.3 million. Oh, yeah, so $500,000, 8.3 million.
You did say 1926, right?
26, yeah. Okay. We're going to talk about what really put Grand Lake and continues to put Grand Lake on the map today, which is Grand Lake is the west entrance to Rocky Mountain National Park. Not without a lot of effort, though. So you can get to Grand Lake in now one of two ways. And that, keep in mind, is only during the summer, because one of those two ways through the national park and going on Fall River Road is closed during the summer. Closed during the winter, open during the summer. Highway 40, which then connects with Highway 34, which is Fall River Road, is the other way you can get there from Denver. You take 70 to 40, you take that exit at Empire, and then you take 40 through Winter Park, through Tabernash, through Granby, you get off at 34, and then you can get to Grand Lake that way. So that way existed, but that was quite a distance to come from Denver. Didn't really quite open up the tourist route, that Highway 40 route. So that's more of your ancient, like this is the trail that Native Americans would have taken to get into the Middle Park region, which is that whole valley that I'm talking about, is that pass that's now Highway 40, called the McClure Pass, right? Is the McClure Pass there? You know, Haley? The McClure Pass on Highway 40. Whatever that pass is called.
The Winter Park one?
Yeah.
No, I don't know what it's called.
So the pass on Highway 40 goes up, and then you end down in Winter Park, which is also known as Middle Park, and this is all when Grand County starts. So that is like the OG way to get into Grand Lake. If you're one of those OG fur trappers, miners, etc., most likely you're taking this route. But in 1920, a new route emerges, and that is because of Rocky Mountain National Park becoming a national park, and then in addition to that, wanting some way to traverse across that whole national park, which is the Continental Divide. The Continental Divide is where water in the United States on one side goes towards the Pacific, on the other side it goes towards the Atlantic. The Rocky Mountain National Park covers a part of that Continental Divide, and they wanted to build a road that went over the Continental Divide in that particular spot. The Highway 40 that we talked about goes over the Continental Divide in another spot, a lot easier spot to build highways from what I understand. So in 1920, they built this dirt road that goes from Estes Park, Colorado to Grand Lake, Colorado. And this is really important because Grand Lake starts to really become a tourist town at that point. One of America's early tourist towns, the OG of the tourist towns that were centered around these new things called national parks. So that was happening. National parks were becoming a thing. But at the same time, another thing was happening, which was how do Americans get around? So already the train was, how most Americans were getting around. At that time, the train did pass through that area. Even to this day, you can take Amtrak to Granby to get to that area. But it was the U.S. highways and the automobile that really transformed the type of vacation an American was looking for. So having these new roads that created these road trips, we like a good old road trip. Rick Brown just did a 12-hour one to get here. those things now become the way that Americans want to enjoy their leisure time. So something is born in Grand Lake. It's called the Circle Tour. Once this 1920 road is opened, Fall River Road, which is interesting. So the first person to go over Fall River Road was someone from Grand Lake, although someone from Estes Park was really fighting for it, which was the National Park Commissioner, I believe. But someone from Grand Lake, the day that that road was finished, which was quite a haul. I mean, you see some of these pictures here. Building this road was tough. It was hard work getting over this mountain pass. There was big banks of snow even going over it. But that didn't stop Grand Lake. It didn't stop one member, because what he thought was, I'm gonna do this before anyone else does. So he got word that this road opened up. He wanted to take a good old-fashioned fishing trip down to the other side in Denver, and then wanted to throw a fish fry that celebrated those fish on the other side. So he did that. The commissioner got pretty ticked off that was on the Estes Park side, and did the trip a day later. He got stuck once though. The other guy didn't, from Grand Lake. So that commissioner did it, and then that was the day that the official grand opening of it was the day that the commissioner came across to Grand Lake, and there was a big celebration there. So Fall River Road really puts Grand Lake more on the map, making it more accessible from the Estes Park side, and also putting it on this route that was a whole tour that was a popular way of taking a vacation back in the 20s. Some of these companies that did these tours across the mountains, it would be like $30 for a 5-day trip to go across. They'd drive you, or you could rent these Jeeps. All your meals were included, all your lodging was included at that time. So back in the 20s, you could go across, do this whole thing, the equivalent to what would be like a 5-day cruise, I guess, which you could do that all for around $30 to $45, depending on the level of package that you had. I thought that was pretty interesting.
By the way,
Since the inception of Grand Lake was really a place that you stayed in the summer. Native Americans agreed on that. Western expansionists agreed on that. Grand Lake was really a nicer place to be during the summer, So around that idea, when Grand Lake was really kind of discovered and becoming an area past the 70s, Grand Lake became this summer destination. And there are still some historic structures in Grand Lake today from that era. Props to Grand Lake for really preserving a lot of its history and a lot of its structures. This is a town where you can see the Kaufman House, which was one of the original boarding houses there in that area. That's just right by Grand Lake. Sagebrush Restaurant is in the old jail. You can still see some of the old jail bars in there as well. They have some of the old hotels as well. You can see all of those on Grand Lake Area Historical Society's website. And you can start to see a transformation in the way these hotels were built as the automobile became the way that people came in. So the automobile transformed really the way that people related to Grand Lake, making it more accessible, making it more of this boom tourist town. And as a result of that, there's a couple museums in Grand Lake. The Kaufman House is one of them that we talked about. And then they built the first motor hotel, which was called the Cottage Court Museum, which is kind of one of those hotels that you could drive up and park outside of. It's all made out of wood. It looks like a lot of structures in Grand Lake. And they deemed that style of architecture mountain rustic, I believe is what they call that in Grand Lake, on how a lot of these structures were built. So interestingly enough, the town decided to purchase both of these early hotels and restore them and make them into museums, so you can really get entrance into the history of Grand Lake by going to Grand Lake. This is also a town where they don't have sidewalks. It's all those old wooden sidewalks like you would see in an old western town. So this town really does transport you into its history that has been so well preserved. And a part of that history is the lodge that is right outside of Rocky Mountain National Park, the Grand Lake Lodge. So we're going to talk a little bit about its history. Just pull up its article like that. So in 2020, the Grand Lake Lodge celebrated its 100th anniversary. So the Rocky Mountain National Park was formed in 1915. Roe Emery suggested the idea of building a lodge near Grand Lake. These lodges were really becoming a thing in the national parks. The Yellowstone had one at that time. Glacier had one at that time, and it was envisioned, why not bring one around Rocky Mountain National Park? Estes Park has the Stanley Hotel, which is the famous Stephen King hotel, where The Shining's idea came up with. So already had this peak Rocky Mountain National Park resort on the other side, and the Grand Lake side didn't have as much of that going on. It had some hotels, but it didn't really have anything that was big, that was a destination. So that's where these entrepreneurs come up with this idea. Emery was a guy that owned one of those transportation companies that I was talking about, that did those tours from Denver and went around the Rocky Mountains, and was one of these early driving tours that went around the area. Frank Huntington, Grand County surveyor, was asked to find a suitable location then and draw up plans for a lodge. And in February of 1919, the park approved the plans, and in April, construction began. One thing that I thought was interesting about the lodge was the way that they diverted water to the lodge. You can see here these old wooden pipes that they used to divert water from Tanahutu Creek, which provided water actually for the Grand Lake Lodge for 80 years, so up until modern times. Now this water is still actually used by the lodge, but used to irrigate as compared to the drinking water. Also, like all these lodges at the time, a part of it was, how can we make this lodge completely off-grid? They weren't on the power grid anymore. They didn't have public water. So Grand Lake Lodge not only established itself as this big decadent lodge with a bunch of private cabins, it had a really large main lodge area with a big seating area with these giant fireplaces, which can still be seen in the lodge today. But they also had to think about, how can we power this place? How can we provide food and water to this place? So these lodges are completely self-sustainable. The lodges are completely self-sustainable in the sense that they had their own power generator on them, so they had a steam power plant, and they also had their own water production facility, as well as water towers on site, which are, they still have all this stuff on site today. So when they built this original big lodge structure, they didn't really know how much it snowed in Grand Lake. So originally, on the inside, it's still the same structure, although there was one fire, they had to remodel it at a certain time. Still the same structure, but originally they only had one of the wood joist going up to lend that building support. First winter came around, roof almost caved in because there was too much snow on it. So then they decided, hey, we're gonna make two of these things. So now double the enforcement came in. There was a big remodel that then happened later in the early 20s. So this thing opens in the 20s, is a big success. There's a big remodel that happens at that time. And it starts to become a spot that people want to visit. So in 1921, this is the first year that it opens up, over 80,000 visitors came through the park and then came to that lodge. Not that many people stayed there though. 1922 was the first year that it opened after the remodel, and then this lodge starts to attract some pretty famous people. So at some point the Ford family had stayed there. It looked like the owners of the Kodak family had stayed there as well.
Were there people that lived there?
There were not people that lived there, and it operated seasonally at first. So and there's all these diaries of some of the early workers that were there. They were really college kids, that they would go to all the colleges in the Midwest and the surrounding area, and they would recruit all these college kids into Grand Lake for the summer. And they had dormitories that they would stay at during that summer. They get paid $50 a month as tip to do it.
Did they get to stay at the lodge though?
They got to stay in the dormitory. So not in the main lodge building, but there was a building on site that was a dormitory there where they all stayed. I mean, really similar to the way ski resorts are operated now, bringing in workers, housing workers, etc.
I wonder how that place was. That place was very party.
It was probably it was a good time. And they had the boys' dormitory, the girls' dormitory. Women did more of the serving staff. The guys did more of the hard labor around. And I was reading some of the journals of them, and one of them said that they got a $150 tip from the Ford family that stayed there. Henry didn't stay; the Ford family stayed there, and he remembered that as being the biggest tip that they had ever received at that time. Not bad. That was 3 months' pay, at that time for them. So this lodge was built, the Emerys built it, and then they start to build kind of a lodge empire here in Colorado, taking one over in Idaho Springs by the hot springs there, which is still there, taking some over in some other areas here in Colorado as well, and they start to build this real tourist destination feel where you can take this whole circle tour, stay in Estes Park, stay in Grand Lake, stay in Idaho Springs, etc. It does pass ownership several times throughout history. In the 20s, it was owned with the family that we were talking about. And then eventually it passes. Let me try to find here. All these, this is all the workers. There's all these pictures of the workers here that are really cool. Okay. So the 50s. At 50, at 78, Roe Emery retired and sold his empire, and T.J. Manning of Denver. So Manning takes this thing over, but was unable to secure adequate financing, and Emery offered the company to two brothers from Nebraska, Isaac B. and Ted L. James. They purchased the assets of the Emery Bus and Lodging Company and formed the Colorado Transportation Company. When they took control of that on 53, you can see all these kind of old buses from there, which are really cool with the glass ceilings. The first year was successful, so they exercised their option on one of the leases on two of the Emery properties that included the Trail Ridge store, which is still there today in the Grand Lake Lodge, and negotiated a 20-year concession contract with Rocky Mountain National Park, which was basically so the park wouldn't take over that area of land and make that lodge still be there for the next 20 years. From that would be the 50s then into the 70s, and that's going to be an important thing that we talk about here in a second. In 61, the James family began negotiations with the park to exclude the Grand Lake Lodge from the park boundaries. The National Park Service Mission 66 project purchased holdings within the parks and returned the land to nature to save the lodge being removed. So in other words, this lodge, they were thinking about removing it. The family that owned it went and bought a bunch of properties where the national park is now and said, hey, if you don't remove this lodge, we'll give you all this other land that's in the park to this day. That's what saved the lodge from being removed, and the James brothers acquired a number of properties inside the park. So it took quite a few properties for them to get it over. And then it also took an act of Congress and the signature of good old JFK to authorize the boundary adjustment. So it was a big effort back then in 1961 to 1963 to keep the Grand Lake Lodge there. So we're so glad that they did. It's such a staple of the community. It makes the national park even feel more like the national park to me. By June of 1963, the brothers agreed to divide their company with IB, which is another investment company coming in. And Ted Jr. joined his father to manage the lodge and the Trail Ridge store staffing, each with, the same thing, college students going into the 60s here. So it became the same kind of staffing. Some pictures of the lodge back in that time period. And at that time, it was said that the lodge operated, very strict, almost like a steakhouse atmosphere. And it was this really formal place at that time. It's really laid back this day. But Grand Lake has always had elements of culture in it, despite, what Denverites may say down the hill. There's even its own yacht club, which we have filmed here. So the Grand Lake has always had a spot for having that socialite side. There's a respiratory theater. There's always been a theater there. For Christmas, they bring in like people from Broadway to do shows there to this day. So Grand Lake, despite being so far away from everything, just remains relevant. There's a lot of stuff to do there, including the center of socialite culture being this Grand Lake Lodge. On July 19th, On July 19th, 1973, a fire broke out in the kitchen and got into the space above the ceiling. This is when they had moved the kitchen there. Before, they actually had a whole separate building as the kitchen. Now, when you go into the Grand Lake Lodge, there's this open concept kitchen and dining area in there. So the kitchen caught this place on fire. The employees saved chairs. The employees at this point, you can see how big this fire was by this picture. We're like, oh crap, we gotta save what we can. They got these old chairs and the taxidermy and stuff, and they just start chucking stuff off this giant porch of the Grand Lake Lodge, which is known as the best porch in North America with its view of Grand Lake and Continental Divide. So they're just on this porch, just chucking all that stuff out, trying to save it. So firefighters at that point cut 3 holes in the roof, and they start dousing water down into there, and they work to stop the fire, and they do, and luckily the fire was contained just to the lodge because there was a recent rain that made it not spread to other buildings in the area. As we know from the recent forest fires that happened back in 2020, a little fire can become a big fire that threatens the whole area really fast in this area, so luckily it didn't happen that time. But what that did do was force the lodge to close for 7 years. They continued to operate Trail Ridge Store, but this place needed to be pretty much rebuilt and rehabbed at that point. It was still there, but there's a lot of work that needed to be done after this place burnt. So the maintenance crew kept it in order, but then the James family decided, obviously they had to renovate that full main building. The arduous job of repeeling the charred, once beautiful hand-peeled logs supporting the structure with a sharp drawl knife began. So they went in and they peeled all the char off, and then a special sealer was used to coat the logs after cleaning them. Employees cleaned up the lobby area of the lodge and turned it into a rec hall with rock and roll dances. Ted James Jr. even purchased a supply of used roller skates, which transformed the lobby into a roller rink for a little bit in that time period until 1980 comes around, and the Grand Lake Lodge once again welcomed guests on a limited basis. The main building was closed except for the front desk, but some of the cabins were reopened, and those cabins were renovated. By 81, David McDougall agreed to lease the kitchen and dining room operation. Upgrades included new exhaust hoods, and so they rebuilt this kitchen, and then they reopened the gift shop in there, and after 7 long years, the Grand Lake Lodge was back in business in full time. In 1993, the United States Department of the Interior listed the Grand Lake Lodge in the National Register of Historic Places. Also, the Grand Lake Lodge in the 90s began hiring staff from the Camp America program in Europe. So you'll see this today, that there's a lot of folks from Eastern Europe that work in Grand Lake, the town, and from Slovakia. And so that went on, and then they said they learned more about people from around the world, about nature, and improved their English in this program, a program that allows people to work here in the United States. Pretty neat. 1994, good old Tim Allen was married at Grand Lake Lodge. Huh? Right, the old Santa Claus, right, came down the chimney. There's several large chimneys there, and he decked this whole place out, and there's some pictures of his wedding. They took it all over, and in 2000, they did a Grand Lake reunion where 675 employees came from all different eras, from those college times to today. So pretty neat. Today, the Grand Lake has served people for over 100 years. It's a cool spot. A lot of people get married there. There's a really cool wedding venue there. Tim Allen knows. Ooh! What were we going to talk about? We're going to talk about Grand Lake today. So Grand Lake today has people not only in the summertime, like Grand Lake of yore, but has a lot of people in the wintertime. And that's because skiing has brought a lot of industry to Grand Lake. Snowmobiling is popular to do around there with some of the most snowmobile trails in North America. I took a shot at it. It was a lot of fun. My drone did not like it, as you can see here. We crashed that thing. We're still trying to fix it. So it's a fun place in the winter. It's a fun place in the summer. It's a beautiful place in the fall when the colors are changing as well. And it's a quiet place in the mud season when all the snow is melting. So side tip, go there in the mud season if you want some really quiet Grand Lake. Although you might find that some of the stores are shut down. So Grand Lake downtown, there's a lot of good restaurants. Sagebrush is open all year round. It's got a really diverse menu. One Love is a great restaurant. It's got some Caribbean food. What are some other ones we like? They were like the one by the boardwalk. They've got some great ice cream. There's like 15 ice cream places in town, of course. One of them makes fudge right there on Main Street. That one's pretty good, but the one on the boardwalk is fire. That one's got the really good ice cream, in our opinion. Sagebrush is always good. What is another restaurant?
Breakfast place. Did you mention that?
I forget what that breakfast place is called, but it's good. It's right at the corner there. They've got a nice menu. It's pretty cheap, but it's also good.
What would you
A really
say
diverse coffee menu.
What would you say are the must hit spots if you're going there for vacation?
For what time of year?
I mean, maybe give a
All right.
weather.
In Grand Lake, if you're going there for a vacation, it depends on what time of year you come here on what you're going to do. So during the winter, there's a lot of things to do, like we had mentioned. Some things that I would do is snowmobiling on Grand Lake. That's really awesome. You got this big open frozen lake that you're snowmobiling on. Something that my parents did that they really enjoyed was a sleigh ride, where they got to do a sleigh ride with some, like the dogs. They also do sleigh rides with horses, if you're looking for more of a romantic sleigh ride during that time of year. So ATVing is really awesome. You've got to take a trip downtown to Grand Lake, walk the boardwalk. There's tons of great stores and local stores that you can support. There's a lot of great restaurants as well. You also have to go to the beach. During the winter, that beach you can ice skate on, so there's a lot of activities down there. During the summer, the Grand Lake turns into a lake town. So you got all the awesome things that every lake town has. You can boat on Grand Lake, you can kayak on Grand Lake. They've got all the marinas that you can rent from right there, as well as the hiking is really amazing. Of course, it goes without saying that there are some nearby ski resorts. Granby Ranch is the closest one open to the public. It's a little bit cheaper and closer than Winter Park, which is also on the way from Denver, if you're coming from Grand Lake. I'll get back to all of them after this.
Okay.
So,
I didn't know if anything was pressing.
there's no emergencies in real estate. We get through all of it, especially because we're talking with them. All right, If you're thinking about living in Grand Lake, maybe your job's remote, because the economy in Grand Lake is really centered around the tourism that we're talking about. But I have noticed an influx of people that work remote since COVID happened. Not everybody has to be somewhere to work. So Grand Lake has an influx of people like that. Grand Lake also has people that buy properties for secondary homes as well as investment properties. That's why we bought a home in Grand Lake. It's a home that's right by Shadow Mountain Lake. One thing that you want to consider when buying a home in Grand Lake is your purpose for renting it. If you're thinking about doing short-term rentals, you're going to want to think about, am I in an HOA community that's banning those? We got lucky. Our HOA community was the last Airbnb property that they let in. They banned them right after us. So they say about 30% of properties allow short-term rentals in Grand Lake. I could definitely help you identify some really good ones there. Once you get past the HOAs, Grand County is actually pretty dang easy to have an Airbnb in, which is not the case in all of Colorado. Like, if you're thinking about doing an Airbnb in Breckenridge, if you're thinking about doing an Airbnb in Aspen, Steamboat, you might want to think again, because it's a little bit hard to get licensing in those areas. It's quite restrictive, and you might want to think, if you're thinking those areas, some areas outside of those towns. Great thing about Grand Lake is Grand Lake's okay with Airbnbs. So you can have an Airbnb in the town of Grand Lake, which is super duper awesome. Grand County also super favorable to Airbnbs. Yes, you have to have a license, But unlike a lot of other counties, they don't cap the number of licenses that the county can have, which is what Clear Creek County does right by us if you were to have one in Idaho Springs. And they also are, pretty generous at giving that license. There are some things that you're gonna want to keep in mind, and if you're curious about it, send us a DM. We can help navigate that area for you. Real estate in Grand Lake ranges anywhere from, I would say, around $650,000 for a single family home. That's smaller, that's below 2,000 square feet, that doesn't have as many rooms and bathrooms, that might not be quite as updated, to $4 million for the massive mansion that's going to have everything for you. There's a lot more homes in that in between that are the 2,000 plus square foot homes right around that million range. There's also some right in that like $700,000-$800,000 range that make for some really good Airbnb investment properties, depending on what your business plan is there. So if you're thinking about getting into Grand Lake, you're going to want to think about the environment. You're also going to want to think about Grand Lake's growth. Grand Lake has done a lot to protect its history. Grand Lake has done a lot to protect its charm. There's not many towns in Colorado that have done that because they have expanded so rapidly due to this, skiing coming in and tourism booming so fast. Grand Lake's been a tourist town. It continues to be a tourist town, and it brings its history into modernity in a way that a lot of other Colorado towns don't. So in that way, I think its appeal to continue to be a place that brings people is going to be there for years and years and years to come. I know that a lot of the business owners in Grand Lake aim to keep Grand Lake a place that keeps its history, so I don't expect that charm is going to go anywhere for a really, really long time. Anything else I should talk about? Thanks for coming on a journey with us to Grand Lake. If you're thinking about visiting Grand Lake, check out our link below for our Airbnb if we're not booked for that weekend. If you're thinking about buying or selling in Grand Lake, we'd love to talk you through that as well. We recently got an Airbnb that we are calling The Grand Escape, which is a 4-bedroom, 3-bathroom home right off of Shadow Mountain. It's super nice there. It's this peaceful, tranquil retreat that has a soaker tub, full kitchen, everything that you would need to take vacation, as well as my favorite part, the hot tub on the porch that overlooks all of Shadow Mountain Lake. So if you have any interest, check that out.